Well, it is good to see each of you tonight, and thank you for being in your place. I know the Lord will bless you for it, and appreciate just the warm welcome here at Delta, even though it's freezing outside, I'll tell you that. But I don't stay far enough away to where my car even warms up. It's kind of a tragedy, you know. But anyway, great to see you here tonight. Let's take our Bibles and go to Isaiah chapter 6, if you will. Isaiah chapter 6. We'll look at a few verses right at the beginning of the chapter. Isaiah chapter 6. In verse number 1 of Isaiah 6, the Bible says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above it stood the seraphims, each one had 6 wings. With 20 he covered his face, and with 20 he covered his feet, and with 20 he did fly. And one cried unto another, and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the posts of the doors moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. Then said I, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphims unto me, having a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with the tongs from off the altar. And he laid it upon my mouth, and said, Lo, this hath touched thy lips, and thine iniquity is taken away, and thy sin purged. Also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then said I, Here am I, send me." There'll be seasons in your life where you'll wonder, where's God? There'll be times where you'll think that maybe God has vacated his throne. He seems absent. Our prayers don't seem to be getting through. And we wonder, where is God? When I was a freshman in college, I met a young lady, and we began to form a friendship. Some would call it dating maybe, but we weren't really serious about it to some degree. We both had committed ourselves to finishing college before we would think about getting married or anything like that. And so we enjoyed a friendship, but and I suppose it was heading in that direction, but we didn't talk about those kinds of things. But as the years went by, she was a year and a half ahead of me, and was going to be graduating in the middle of my junior year. And she was a secondary education major and had signed a contract to go teach in a Christian school in Indiana. And God had called me to preach and was leading me toward evangelism, and we had talked about these things on several occasions, that it just seemed like we were going different directions. There was no way that this could possibly be God's will for us to continue our relationship, because we were going different directions and at different times, and it just seemed like, though we had a great appreciation for each other, this couldn't be God's will. And so one day after lunch we were talking, and we decided to end our relationship. There weren't any problems per se. We ended on a good note. But we decided that this just wasn't what God had planned for us. And after that short meeting, I went to an afternoon speech class, and always had a good time in there. It was an upper level class and knew everybody in there. We always had a good time. But that day I sat over by the windows all by myself because I couldn't stop crying. Now, I'm not a crier, but that day I couldn't stop crying. It just seemed like there was something missing in my life all of a sudden. And I remember sitting there thinking, God, where are you? It was 1975. I was scheduled to preach 3 weeks of revival, 3 in a row, in the city of Los Angeles. I had never been to the state of California, much less the city of Los Angeles. And so I got in my car and began to travel across the country. In those days, there were no interstate highways. Speed limit was 55 miles an hour on a 2-lane road. I was driving a Volkswagen Beetle at the time with no air conditioning. And I'm making my way across the country, and I'm thinking to myself, my geography teachers lied to me. There is no Pacific Ocean. I mean, I just drove and drove and drove, and just seemed like I was never going to get to the end of the country in California. And finally, after about 3 days of solid driving, I crossed the border into California and made my way to the first revival meeting at a church in La Puente, California, heart of Los Angeles, right really now in the middle of LA. And of course, we didn't have GPS in those days. We had maps. And for the young people here tonight, a map is a piece of paper with lines on it. And the lines represent roads, and they connect at some point, and you follow those lines and get to your destination. And so I'm trying to balance this map on my steering wheel and driving on 5-lane highways, wondering, what am I doing? And finally, about 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, I pulled into the first church, and I was just so glad to be there. And there was a man working in the flower beds, kind of sprucing things up a little bit, and I got out of the car, walked over to him, and introduced myself. And after I did, he introduced himself to me as the pastor. And after we introduced ourselves, he said, "What can I do for you?" I said, "Well, I'm here to hold a revival." He said, "I don't know anything about that." Here I was in the city of Los Angeles. I didn't have a cell phone. Nobody did. I didn't have a credit card. Nobody did. I didn't have a debit card. Those weren't invented yet either. I had $36 in my pocket. And I had 6 days to survive. I got back in my car and I drove out in front of the church on the road in front of it, and I began to travel and went about 10, 12 blocks maybe, and I came to what I affectionately call a flea bag hotel. There were actually two of them side by side, and I picked the one that looked the best and walked into the lobby, and the lady said, "How can I help you?" And I said, "Well, I think I'm going to need to see the manager." So she picked up a phone and made a call, and pretty soon this gentleman showed up, and he said, "What can I do for you?" I said, "Well, I'm going to be in your town the next 6 nights, and I need a room." He said, "No problem." I said, "Well, there's a little bit of a problem." I said, "I only have $36. He thought for a minute, and he reached down under the counter, and he pulled out a ring of keys. And he said, "Follow me." We went out a back door into a courtyard area, and it was all grown up with weeds and tall grass. And in this courtyard, there were broken beds and old dressers of drawers that had been junked there. And we made our way across that area to an iron door, and he took one of those keys and opened it up, pushed it back. And here was a room about 12 by 12. It had a tile floor, had a military cot on one wall with a mattress. There was a shower, there was a sink, there was a commode, and there was a metal folding chair. He said, "It's all yours for $6 a night." I gave him my $36, and he left. When he closed the door, I noticed something out of my peripheral, and I looked, and there was a shelf above the door, and on that shelf was a little small television set. Now I remember thinking to myself, well, at least I have a TV. And I went over to it, and I clicked it on, and it was showing snow. Kind of a black background with white lines going across. And I thought, man, I'm in California. I didn't come to see snow. So I went to the next channel, but it was showing the same program, and all the way around the 13 channels, it was nothing but static. I remember clicking that TV off, sitting on that bed thinking, God, where are you? It was 1982. I was traveling with my wife and 2 children at that time in a trailer. We were pulling a fifth-wheel trailer from church to church and living in it and holding revivals. And we were in Warrenville, Illinois, a western suburb of Chicago. The pastor was a very kind man, a very compassionate man, probably one of the most gracious men I've ever known in my life. He was a church planter. And he would go to a city and plant a church, and he would stay usually 2 years, get it up and running, and then he would call the pastor to come, and he'd move on. And I had been with him a time or two before in some other places, and And here he was in Warrenville. And he was renting a house on the edge of town, a big 3-story house. He had 7 children. And we backed our trailer into his driveway and got set up. And that week, if it could go wrong, it went wrong. I mean, it was like Murphy's Law. Everything just that we tried, everything that we did, it just seemed to go wrong. We were renting an elementary school for the meetings, and the janitor never showed up one time. We had to break in the building just to have the service. And night after night, we couldn't get anybody to come. It was just a small handful of people. And the pastor was greatly discouraged. And on Wednesday, I said to my wife, I said, Pastor Boersma is really struggling here, and I don't know what the love offering will be at the end of the week, but I think God maybe wants us to give it to him and his family because he sure needs to need it more than we do. And my wife said, I've been thinking the same thing. I said, well, let's pray about it. We got a couple days yet. And so Friday night came and nothing had changed. And we went into the house and played some games with the kids and had some popcorn. And pretty soon he pulled out an envelope and he said the usual, Brother Goetsch, wish it could be more. We did our best and hope this is a blessing. And for the first time and last time in my ministry, I opened it up in front of the pastor and I took out that check because I was going to sign the back of it and give it back to him. And when I pulled that check out of the envelope, I couldn't help but notice the amount. It was for $250. Now, in 1982, that was a lot of money. And it was an amazing amount of money for a week of revival meetings. I had no idea where they could have gotten that money. But I signed the back of it, and I handed it to him. I said, Pastor, God wants you to have this. And he tried to protest, and I stuffed it in his pocket, and he began to cry, and his wife began to cry, and all 7 kids began to cry, and we got out of there. I mean, no sense hanging around that, when you obey God and stuff like that, the Lord, you feel really good about it, We slept like a rock, got up the next morning, hooked everything up, and headed to St. James, Minnesota. And I had 40 gallons of fuel in my truck, and we started out of Chicago and up through Wisconsin, and we went across on I-90, and we got to La Crosse, Wisconsin. And both my fuel tanks were on empty. And I had well over 100 miles to go. And I remember thinking, Lord, I need gas. And the Lord said, well, get some. I said, well, that's easy for you to say. I don't have any money. I still didn't have a credit card, debit card, none of that stuff. I had given all my money to the pastor in Chicago. I said, Lord, I don't have any money. He said, pull over and get some. Now, I had heard stories about preachers pulling into a gas station, filling their tank, and someone else paying for it. I didn't have that kind of faith. I was operating on a cash basis. and I said, Lord, I don't have any money. And he said, yeah, you do. And I remembered in the trailer we had this bucket that we'd bought for the kids to play in the dirt with, and the handle had broken the first day they got it. But it was kind of a fluorescent yellow, and the kids really liked it, so we cleaned it up. And for whatever reason, we were throwing our pennies in that bucket. We weren't saving them for anything particular. Just every time we got pennies, the kids would throw them in that bucket. And it was about 3/4 full. And God said, use that. So I pulled into a gas station in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and bought 40 gallons of fuel with pennies. I'll never forget the expression of the guy's face as he counted them 2 by 2 on that glass counter. Nor will I forget the expression of the 7 people behind me waiting to pay for their gas. But we got to St. James, Minnesota, a little clapboard building on the edge of town by the fairgrounds of the Manor Baptist Church. The youngest person in the church was 65 and had about 30 people. And we got set up and Sunday morning went in, taught Sunday school, had the morning service, and no one said anything about lunch. So we went out to the trailer and we had a few canned goods we threw together, and I thought, well, they'll feed us tonight, And we went in the evening, preached the evening service, and the pastor came up after. He said, well, I got to go to work at 4 tomorrow morning. I got to get to bed. I'll see you tomorrow night at 7. We went to bed hungry. The next morning, I was out washing my vehicle down. I always like to get that road grime off on Monday mornings, and I was out behind that trailer having a pity party. I said, God, where are you? I mean, I saw what you did, and I did what you told me to do, and I have no doubt about that. And you got us here, but Lord, where are you now? I can fast for a week, but I got a wife and 2 kids in there, and if I don't feed them, I've denied the faith worse than an infidel. Your words, not mine. Where are you? There'll be times in your life where you'll wonder, where is God? And I think Isaiah's there. The king has died. There's no leadership. The nation is vulnerable. And Isaiah is wondering, as the prophet, what next? What are we supposed to do? God, where are you? May I remind you that Jesus Christ has been there. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring? Jesus Christ on the cross was forsaken by God himself. Now we know from the Bible that God never leaves us nor forsakes us. That's a promise that we can go to the bank with. But all of us also know that we are prone to wander. Like sheep, we are easily drawn astray. And there are times in our life where we get in that spot and we wonder, God, where are you? And I think Isaiah, though not the primary interpretation of the text, but in a subliminal way, Isaiah shows us 3 locations where we can always find God. The first one is the holy place. As Isaiah gets this glimpse into heaven at the throne room of God, he sees these angelic beings called seraphims. They had 6 wings. With twain they covered their face, with twain they covered their feet, with twain they did fly. And the Bible records here that one of them cries out, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The word holy is the qualifying word for everything that God is. God is a God of love, but his love is a holy love. God is a God of wrath. The Bible says he's angry with the wicked every day, Psalm 7:11. But his wrath is a holy wrath. God is a God of justice, but his justice is a holy justice. Everything that God is has as its qualifier the holiness of God. In the book of Exodus, chapter 15 and verse 11, who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like unto thee, glorious in holiness? The psalmist in Psalm 99 and verse 9 says, worship toward his holy hill, for the Lord our God is holy. John the Revelator in chapter 15 and verse 4 writes, who shall not fear thee and glorify thy name, for thou only art holy. Now remember, holy and unholy cannot fellowship. Righteousness and unrighteousness cannot coexist. And if we want the blessing of God, the presence of God, the power of God, the provision of God in our life, we've got to stay in the holy place. God told his people, the nation Israel, in Leviticus chapter 11, he said, I am the Lord that brought you out of the land of Egypt. Ye shall be holy, for I, the Lord thy God, am holy. The Corinthian church was a church that certainly struggled with the temptation of the world. The Corinthian church struggled with some of the carnality and the worldliness that was all about them. And when Paul writes to that church in 2 Corinthians 7 and verse 1, he says, having therefore these promises, dearly beloved, let us cleanse ourselves of all filthiness of flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the sight of the Lord. How hard do we work at being holy? We work hard at our jobs. We work hard to provide for our families. We try to serve well in the church. We try to do all these things well, but do we perfect holiness in our life? Now, I know what people say, well, Brother Goetsch, it's 2026. These are different times. Our culture is a lot different than it was in the Bible times, and God doesn't expect his people to be like they were back then. Well, Titus chapter 2 and verse 11 talks about the grace of God that saves us. And by the way, that's the only way we can get saved, is by the grace of God. We can't buy it, we can't earn it, we can't merit it. It's only by God's grace that we're saved. For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It's the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. So we're saved by grace. And in the next verse, Paul teaches us what that grace, Paul writes what that grace teaches us. He says in verse 12, Titus chapter 2, teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, godly in this present world. Now, whether you're reading Titus 2:12 in the first century or the 21st century, it's still this present world. In other words, God demands that we be holy as obedient children, not fashion yourselves according to your former lust or ignorance, but as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation. Interestingly, in Hebrews 12 and verse 14, it says, follow peace and holiness, without which no man can see the Lord. In other words, if we're going to decide, well, I can live however I want to, it doesn't matter how I behave, I believe, I'm a Christian, it really doesn't matter, I'm saved forever, I can live however I please, I have liberty. If that's your position, God says, God's going to be absent. God's going to be afar off. God's not going to be close at hand, because holy and unholy cannot coexist. And so when God seems absent, we must go back to the holy place. But secondly, he mentions the location of the humble place. It's interesting, as Isaiah gets this glimpse of the throne room of God, his response in verse 5 is, woe is me, for I'm undone. His immediate response is one of humility. He realizes that he falls far short of the glory of God. And he's humbled by how holy God is and how sinful he is. Humility. Isaiah 66 and verse 2 says, to this man will I look, even to him that is of a poor and a contrite spirit, and that trembleth at my word. If you want God to look your way, if you want God's hand of blessing upon your life, you've got to stay in the humble place. See, God doesn't hang around his abominations. And everyone that is proud in heart, Proverbs 16:5, is an abomination unto the Lord. These 6 things that the Lord hate, these 7 are an abomination on him, a proud look. I love Psalm 138 verse 6. It says, though the Lord be high, well, I guess he's pretty high. You can't go any higher than God, right? Nobody above him. He's the name above all names. So though the Lord be high, yet hath he respect unto the lowly. But the proud he knoweth afar off. See, if I asked you, who do you respect? Well, it would depend on the context of the conversation. If you were talking about maybe music, you're talking to a musician. Who do you respect as a musician? Well, typically someone that loves music, they would respect somebody that's a little more advanced than they are, right? They would look up to somebody who has more training or more experience, and they would look up to them. Boy, I'd like to be like them. If we're talking about sports, an athlete is always looking up. He's looking at that next level. A high school athlete would look at a college athlete and say, man, that's where I want to get. Or a college would look at a professional athlete. I want to be as good as that guy. In business, a startup business would look to an established business, one that is successful, one that treats their employees right, one that provides a great service in the community, and says, that's the kind of business I want to have. We are constantly looking up. Well, who does God look up to? He's on top. The Bible says he has respect unto the lowly. But the proud, he knoweth afar off. You see, when God seems absent, perhaps we have drifted from the humble place. God says we're to be clothed with humility, because God resisteth the proud, but gives grace to the humble. When I was a boy growing up in church, I would hear preachers, evangelists, pastors, missionaries talk about a man named Paul Levine. And he was an evangelist. And people would tell stories about his ministry and about his preaching and about his life. And I would listen to these and I'd think as a boy, man, this guy sounds like an amazing man that God's using. And I remember thinking, I'd like to meet Paul Levine someday. And all through my younger years, I heard about Paul Levine, but never got to meet him. Dr. Levine was saved in Waterloo, Iowa at the age of 4. He was called to preach at the age of 4. Don't underestimate what God does in children's lives. His mother said when Dr. Levine got saved at age 4 and called to preach, he would come home at night and he would grab his little New Testament, jump up on the piano bench and start preaching. Paul Levine finished high school at age 15 and went immediately into evangelism. Never went to college. Just started traveling from church to church, preaching revivals. Couldn't drive. He was only 15. Had to hitchhike, take public transportation. By age 17, he had a man traveling with him named Bob Findley. Bob Findley was completely blind. And Dr. Levine and Brother Findley would play their mandolins and they would sing and traveled all over the upper Midwest, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan. If you go to any of those states tonight and mention in a Baptist church Paul Levine, you'll have somebody come up and say, I got saved under Paul Levine. Happens every time I do it. Dr. Levine had a radio broadcast out of Waterloo, Iowa called Bible Echoes. 6 days a week, he preached the gospel on the radio. He had a ministry called Bible Tracts Incorporated, still in existence today, long after his death, that printed millions of tracts in thousands of languages that went around the world. An amazing man. I never met him. In 1981, I was holding a revival at the Faith Baptist Church in Danville, Illinois. And one day the church secretary ran out to the trailer there in the parking lot. She knocked on our door and she said, you have a phone call. Well, I ran inside the church, still didn't have cell phones in those days. And so ran in the church to take this call. And the voice on the other end of the call identified itself as Dr. Bill Rice III at the Bill Rice Ranch in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Now, I had heard of the ranch. I knew a few things about the ranch. I knew the Rice family, so to speak. I had heard Dr. John Rice preach, Dr. Joe B. Rice preach, his brother, Bill Rice, his brother. I heard them all preach when I was in college. I heard his brother, Pete Rice, preach, Bill III preach, but I never met any of these people. I'd never been to the ranch. I knew nothing really much. And I thought, why is he calling me? And he said, Brother Goetsch, we've never met, but I've heard about your ministry, and he said, I'd like to invite you to come to the ranch and preach one of our youth weeks 2 years from now, 1983. Could you have your calendar handy there? I did. I pulled it out. He said, here's a week we'd like to have you. And I had it available, and I booked that meeting over the phone. Man, I was on cloud 9. Not because I was going to get to preach at the ranch. I was going to get to meet Paul Levine. You see, the ranch started in 1953. Bill and Kathy Rice had a deaf daughter. And they bought a piece of property, 1,500 acres outside of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and they established the Bill Rice Ranch, where deaf people could come and hear the gospel in sign language. Well, there weren't enough deaf people to fill every week on the calendar, so they started having hearing weeks as well for families and teenagers and conferences of sorts. And they started a youth week in 1953, and the first youth speaker at the Bill Rice Ranch was Paul Levine. And he had preached every youth week from 1953 until really his death in the 90s. Well, some time went by and those youth weeks began to grow to 2 weeks and then 3 weeks and 4 weeks and 7 weeks. And so the preaching schedule was very heavy on Dr. Levine to preach that many weeks at the ranch to teenagers. And so they started bringing in a second speaker to kind of offload some of this burden of preaching. And I was going to get to be that second preacher. Man, I couldn't wait for that week to come. The first night I walked in a side door into the John R. Rice Auditorium. There were 1,400 teenagers seated waiting for the service to start. 1,400. That wasn't counting the adults, the staff, the counselors, none of that, just the teenagers. I didn't even look at them. I walked in that door and I thought, I wonder if I'm going to meet Paul Levine tonight. And a man approached me and he put out his hand. He said, "Welcome to the ranch, Dr. Goetsch." And it was Bill Rice III. And we had never met yet. And he welcomed me to the ranch. We chatted a bit. And he said, "Come up on the platform. I want you to meet Dr. Paul." Whoa, right now? I looked up on the platform. There were about 8 steps up to the platform. It was a very high platform. And there was nothing on the platform except the pulpit, a piano, and one pew that ran all the way across the back of the platform. It was about 30 feet long. There was nobody on that platform except for one person. He was sitting at the very end of that pew. He was sitting there with his Bible open and a steno notebook hanging out of it, and he had his pen. He's writing. It's Dr. Paul Levine. He's preaching that night, and he's writing a sermon. and I followed Dr. Bill up those steps. And Dr. Bill said, "Brother Paul, this is Brother Goetsch." And Dr. Levine, he closed that Bible, closed that notebook, put his pen away, and he grabbed my hand with both of his, and he said, "Brother Goetsch, I'm so honored to meet you. I can't wait to hear you preach." I thought, hear me preach? I'm here to hear you preach. He said, "Here, sit by me, sit by me." Whoa. I sat down next to him on that long pew. He reopened his Bible and the notebook, started scribbling more notes. I couldn't read a thing he was writing. I tried. The service started. Dr. Stoltenborough began to lead those teenagers in singing, and the place was electric. Dr. Paul's writing his sermon, praying. You could just sense it. And it got time to introduce him. And Dr. Bill walked up to the platform, to the pulpit, and he said, "Now, young people, tonight we get to hear Dr. Paul Levine. Dr. Levine has preached every youth week here since 1953. And he said, "Dr. Paul, how many sermons have you preached here at the ranch?" Well, he wasn't even listening. He's still writing his sermon. But he heard his name and his head popped up and he said, 1,204. And Dr. Bill said, "Think of that, young people, 1,204 times this man has preached the Bible to young people just like you." And Dr. Paul, he punched me in the ribs. He said, "I really don't know how many times I preached." He said, "All I know is I ran out of sermons a long time ago." That was Dr. Paul, humble. One night we were together there a couple years later, and the week wasn't going real great. The kids weren't responding real well. It was Thursday night. It was Dr. Paul's turn to preach. And I could tell all through that song service he was burdened, praying, writing, burdened. Finally, during the special number, I just lightly touched him on the knee. He always wanted me to sit next to him. I touched him on the knee. I said, "Dr. Paul, I'm praying for you." And he leaned into me. And he said, "Oh, thanks, Brother Goetsch." He said, "People tell me to trust the Lord. Trust the Lord. I do. But I don't trust the devil." It was things like that he said that began to shape so many things in my life. I don't remember the year now. But I was asked to do one session at a conference in Menominee Falls, Wisconsin. It was a 3-hour session right after lunch. The conference went all week. I had one shot for 3 hours at these pastors. And I did my best to keep them awake. And when I finally got through those 3 hours, I dismissed them and they all went out to go get their dinner and come back for the great service that night. And my job was basically done. I mean, I was going to stay and enjoy the whole conference, but my part in it was done. And I packed up my Bible and my notes and I was headed off the platform. And while everybody was going that way out the back, there was one man coming down the middle aisle. He was groping from pew to pew now, very frail in body, in his 90s, legally blind, his wife already in heaven. He would join her in just 2 more weeks. Cancer riddling his entire body. And he had that Bible, that notebook, and a pen in his hand. And I jumped off that platform. I said, Dr. Paul, Dr. Paul, I didn't know you were here. You know what he said? He didn't say, hey, Brother Goetsch. He pointed at that steno notebook, and he had written letters about 3 inches high so he could read it. He pointed at that notebook and he said, I missed letter E under point 5. What was letter E under point 5? I thought, you don't need it. You're going to die in 2 weeks. Go over here and sit down and wait. I said, oh, Dr. Paul, you don't need it. Tears began to run down his cheeks. He said, oh, Brother Goetsch, write it in here. Write it real big so I can read it. I want to be more like Jesus. I want to know my Bible better. I need letter E under point 5. That was Dr. Paul. The humble place. God will meet you there. But there's one more spot. There's the holy place. There's the humble place. But then in verse 8, he heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Then said I, here am I, send me. The harvest place. When God seems absent in your life, grab some tracts. Go pass them out. He'll meet you there. Call pastor and say, Pastor, is there somebody ill that I can go visit, or somebody shut in that I could make a call? God will meet you there. Because he's all about the harvest. We don't know much about the life of Jesus from the time he was about 2 until the time he started his public ministry at age probably 30. So the Bible is really silent about Jesus' life for a couple of decades there, except for one time. Do you remember it? He was 12 years old, and his earthly parents had taken him up to Jerusalem to a feast. And they traveled in a company because it was a 3-day journey, and so they traveled together in a group, probably for accountability, safety, maybe fellowship, we don't know, but they traveled together. They get up to Jerusalem, they celebrate the feast, and now this company of people heads for home. Another 3-day journey back home. And they got 1 day into the journey when they realized, we've lost God. How do you lose God? But they lost him. Can you imagine this conversation? Joseph, where's Jesus? I'm not sure, Mary. I thought he was with you. Well, he's not with me, Joseph. I assumed he was with you. Well, no, Mary, he's not with me. I'm not sure where he is. Well, when did you last see him, Joseph? When we left Jerusalem. Left Jerusalem? That was 24 hours ago. Joseph, where is he? And they realized they left him at church. And so they were running back to the church. And they get back to Jerusalem and they found him in the temple. And as a 12-year-old boy, he's discussing the Bible with the scholars of the day. Now, the Bible is a book. You have to read a book. You can't watch a book. You can't go home tonight and watch the Bible. You can go home and read the Bible, but you can't watch it. You can't hear it per se. So you got to provide some of that. When Mary approaches Jesus there in the temple, this is what she said. These are the words. Son, thy father and I have sought thee sorrowing. Where hast thou been? Those are the words. I don't think that was the emotion, do you? If you ever lost your kid at Walmart, son, where were you? Oh, I worried sick. I'm sure that Mary was a little bit emotional here. And Jesus looked at his mom. And he said, how is it that you sought me? Wist you not that I must be about my Father's business? You should have known where to look. I'd be in the harvest place. I'm always there. When God seems absent, come back to the holy place. Get to the humble place. Get to the harvest place. By the way, that girl I broke up with that day, we've been married now 52 years. But see, at that moment in my life, I wasn't ready for something as sacred and important as marriage. There was some purging, right? There were some things that needed to get out of my life. And those 6 days in that hotel in LA, that door never opened. No one ever came in. I never went out. Never ate a bite of food. And I've preached thousands of weeks of revival since. But that was the best revival meeting I've ever been in. Because it was just me and God in the humble place. See, when I graduated from college, I was ready to hit the stadiums. Okay, Lord, book the LA Coliseum. I got 3 messages. I'm ready. God said, no. We got to go to the humble place first. And that Monday morning, behind my trailer, having a pity party in St. James, a car pulled in. It was a 1954 Ford, an old antique car, and behind the wheel was a man in those parts they affectionately called Tiny. He weighed way north of 400 pounds, a huge man. He was not a member of Manor Baptist Church, but he had been there, he and his wife and his 2 little girls, the night before, Sunday night. They had driven 40 miles. It was the closest church to their home that preached the Bible. And he asked the pastor, can we talk to the evangelist? My wife and I, we sat on the front row after the service, and he told us how difficult it was becoming to drive 80 miles to church with their little girls, and how it was taxing them and destroying some things in their family because of the pressures of that. And he said, we don't know what to do. We would start a church, but we don't know anything about that. He said, what? We'll keep driving if that's what it takes. We have to have a church. He said, what do we do? And we didn't know much, but we just sat there and prayed with him and cried with him and gave him the best advice we knew. He pulls in that church parking lot. He sees me behind the trailer and he rolls the window down. He says, Brother Goetsch, do you need any food? Who asks a dumb question like that? I put down the hose and my brush and I strolled over to the car and said, what are you talking about? He said, do you need any food? I said, well, sure. He said, get in the car, get in the car. We got in. We started driving 40 miles to his house. After a few miles, I said, Tiny, what's this all about? He said, I work for the Jolly Green Giant. I'm thinking, oh, what's your job? Are you the mascot or what? I mean, the guy's huge. I didn't know it, but St. James is in the most fertile valley of soil anywhere in the U.S., and there are tens of thousands of acres of vegetable farms. And Jolly Green Giant and Del Monte, they all have processing plants there. And Tiny was an executive with Jolly Green Giant. He said, Brother Goetsch, I came out in my garage this morning to get in my car to go to work. I got 4 freezers in my garage, plumb full of food. We mispackage it, we mislabel it. I bring it home, I throw it in those freezers. As I got in my car, I looked at those freezers and I thought, I wonder if that preacher's hungry. Now I'm sitting here thinking, this is great. This is awesome. But seriously, green beans? I mean, I'm hungry, but broccoli? I mean, Lord, couldn't you talk to a beef farmer or somebody, you know? We got to that house, he rolled up that garage door, opened those freezers, and I couldn't believe it, but Jolly Green Giant made Swiss steak and lasagna. And, I mean, it was unbelievable. He loaded that 54 Ford up with box after box of food. We got back to the church. We had to put it in the pastor's freezer, the church freezer, our freezer. By the end of the week, we were giving away box food to anybody who would come listen to me for 5 minutes, then they could leave. You know, it's amazing. You know what God said? He said, son, you just stay on that front row, ministering to people. I can feed you. When God seems absent, get to the holy place. Is there something in your life tonight that's separating you from God? Get to the humble place. Is pride, you know, I've been saved a while, I got this. Is pride present? God knows us, but from a long way away. How about the harvest? When's the last time we went out into the fields? That's where he is. He'll see you there. Let's bow for prayer.